Your presence makes sharing these stories worthwhile. Tell us, where are you tuning in from today? Big city? Small town? Share with us in the comments. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Taken for Granted. Nolan Pierce never considered himself extraordinary. At 42, he built a modest custom furniture business from scratch after years of working in his grandfather's woodshop. What he lacked in business acumen, he made up for with craftsmanship that attracted a small but loyal clientele who appreciated quality over mass production. His relationship with his wife, Victoria, had begun 15 years ago when they met at an art exhibition where he displayed a hand-carved dining set. Victoria, a real estate agent with ambitions larger than their Midwestern town of Lakewood, had been impressed not just by his work but by his quiet confidence. Their courtship had been swift, passionate, and to everyone's surprise, they married within 6 months. Victoria's family, the affluent Caldwells, had never fully embraced Nolan. Preston Caldwell, Victoria's father, was a prominent developer who viewed Nolan's craftsmanship as quaint but ultimately inconsequential. Diane Caldwell, her mother, maintained a polite distance, occasionally commenting on how Victoria might have married up had she waited. Victoria's younger brother, Dominic, a venture capitalist, barely disguised his contempt for Nolan's modest ambitions. For years, Nolan had weathered their subtle digs at family gatherings. Victoria usually defended him, though lately her defenses had grown perfunctory. Their marriage had cooled over the past year, as Victoria spent more time networking with clients and less time at home. Nolan attributed it to her recent partnership with Bryant Nelson, a smooth-talking commercial real estate broker who'd moved to Lakewood from Chicago 3 years ago. The fateful Tuesday began ordinarily enough. Victoria had forgotten her old phone at home, the one she kept as a backup but rarely used. Nolan had been cleaning their home office when he noticed it needed charging. Plugging it in, he was surprised when it lit up with notifications from a WhatsApp group labeled Family Matters. Curious why Victoria maintained a separate family chat he wasn't included in, he opened it. The most recent message from Dominic read, "V, are you bringing the charity gala tickets tomorrow? Bryant wants to know what time to pick you up." Scrolling up revealed a conversation that made Nolan's stomach turn. A message from Victoria's mother. "He's so pathetic, always putting this family first even when we treat him like trash." Victoria had responded, "It's worked for 12 years. Besides, he'll be replaced soon enough with someone better aligned with our interests." Dominic had added, "Bryant's already more family than Nolan ever was. At least he understands ambition." Preston had chimed in, "The furniture maker served his purpose. Victoria needed stability while establishing her career. Now she needs someone who can actually contribute to her advancement." Nolan sat motionless, reading 3 years of similar exchanges. His in-laws had never accepted him, but discovering Victoria's active participation in their dismissal of him cut deep. References to Bryant peppered the recent conversations, with unmistakable implications of an affair. That evening, Victoria returned home to find Nolan unusually quiet during dinner. "Everything okay?" she asked, barely looking up from her phone. "Absolutely," Nolan replied, his mind already formulating what would come next. "Just thinking about some changes I want to make." "To what?" Victoria asked absently. "Everything," Nolan said, offering her a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That night, as Victoria slept, Nolan silently moved to the guest bedroom with his tablet. He began meticulously documenting the information he'd discovered and mapping out his response. He wasn't going to confront anyone yet. No, they had all underestimated him for years. They thought him simple, predictable, and malleable. They were about to discover how wrong they'd been. Chapter 2. The Architect of Change. The following morning, Nolan woke earlier than usual. By the time Victoria emerged from their bedroom, he had prepared her favorite breakfast, avocado toast with poached eggs and fresh coffee. "What's the occasion?" Victoria asked, suspicion barely concealed behind her smile. "No occasion," Nolan replied warmly. "Just want to do something nice for my wife." Victoria, check her watch. "Well, thanks, but I'm meeting clients early today. I'll grab something on the way." Nolan nodded understandingly. "The Westfield property?" Victoria paused. "No, The commercial space downtown. Bryant and I are showing it to potential investors. Bryant Nelson, Nolan said casually. You've been working with him quite a bit lately. He has connections I don't, Victoria replied, gathering her things. And he knows the commercial market better than I do. Smart partnership, Nolan said, keeping his tone light. Will you be home for dinner? Don't count on it, Victoria called over her shoulder. These meetings usually run late. After she left, Nolan made 2 phone calls. The first was to Leonard Russo, an attorney he'd befriended years ago when designing custom bookshelves for his office. The second was to Patricia Winters, a private investigator recommended by Leonard. By noon, Nolan had arranged a discreet meeting with both at a cafe 3 towns over. He arrived early, selecting a corner table with a view of the entrance. Patricia spoke first after introductions. Leonard mentioned you need surveillance, but not much else. What exactly are we looking at here, Mr. Pierce? I believe my wife is having an affair with her business partner, Nolan stated calmly. I need evidence, but there's more to it than that. He pulled out a tablet and showed them screenshots he'd taken of the family group chat. I've been played for a fool by my wife and her entire family. They've been manipulating me, using me, and planning to discard me once I've served my purpose. I want to know everything. The affair, their business dealings, any potential illegalities. Leonard studied the messages. You're looking at grounds for divorce, certainly. But what exactly is your end goal here, Nolan? Nolan's expression remained neutral. Justice, Leonard. Not revenge, justice. They've treated me as invisible and inconsequential. I want them to understand what happens when you underestimate someone. Patricia nodded. Standard surveillance package to start? Photos, recordings of meetings, trackings of locations, and timing patterns? Yes, Nolan confirmed. But I also want deeper investigation into Bryant Nelson. His sudden appearance in our town 3 years ago strikes me as convenient. I want to know where he came from, why he left, and whether his business dealings are as legitimate as he claims. That's more extensive, Patricia noted. Business background, financial investigation. It gets expensive. I have money they don't know about, Nolan said quietly. My grandfather left me a property and savings I never mentioned to Victoria or her family. I've maintained it separately for years. Use what you need. By the end of the meeting, a plan was in motion. Patricia would begin surveillance immediately. Leonard would prepare potential legal strategies based on what they discovered. As Nolan drove home, his phone buzzed with a text from Victoria, working late with Bryant. Don't wait up. He typed back. No problem. Taking some clients to dinner myself. Sleep well. There were no clients, of course. Instead, Nolan drove to his workshop and began crafting something special. An intricate wooden box with hidden compartments, a physical manifestation of the secrets he was uncovering. As his hands worked the wood, his mind continued architecting the justice that would come. Chapter 3. Pieces in Motion. For the next 2 weeks, Nolan embodied the role of the oblivious husband perfectly. He maintained his regular schedule, showed interest in Victoria's increasing late nights, and even accepted a dinner invitation to the Caldwell estate without complaint. The family dinner proved particularly illuminating. Seated at Preston Caldwell's imposing dining table, Nolan observed the subtle glances between Victoria and her family with new awareness. Nolan, Preston began during dessert, Victoria tells me your little furniture business has been slow lately. Craftsmanship takes time, Nolan replied pleasantly. I've actually been quite busy with custom orders. Preston exchanged a look with Dominic. Perhaps it's time to consider modernizing. Bryant was telling us about investment opportunities in commercial property that could diversify your income streams. How thoughtful of Bryant to consider my finances, Nolan said, noting how Victoria stiffened slightly. Is he becoming the family financial advisor now? He understands the value of growth, Diane interjected, something this family has always prioritized. Indeed, Nolan agreed, raising his wine glass. To growth and change. They often come when least expected. Later that evening, Patricia called with her first report. Victoria had indeed been spending her late nights with Bryant Nelson at his lake house 15 miles outside of town. The surveillance photos showed them arriving together, embracing at the door. There's more, Patricia added. I've been looking into Nelson's background. He left Chicago rather suddenly 3 years ago after working for Meridian Properties. I'm still digging, but there are some irregularities in his employment record. Keep digging, Nolan instructed, and I want you to expand surveillance to include Dominic Caldwell. The family seems unusually invested in Bryant's relationship with Victoria. The following morning, Nolan received an email from Leonard with divorce preparation documents. The subject line read, "Review when ready, no rush." Nolan appreciated Leonard's discretion. He wasn't rushing toward divorce, at least not yet. Justice required perfect timing. That afternoon, Victoria surprised Nolan by stopping by his workshop, something she hadn't done in months. "This is beautiful," she said, running her hand along a half-finished walnut dining table. "Commission piece?" "Yes," Nolan replied, setting down his sanding block. "For the Harmons. Anniversary gift." Victoria nodded, then hesitated. "Listen, I've been thinking. We should take a vacation soon. Maybe that lake house rental we liked a few years ago." Nolan studied her face carefully. Was this guilt or something else? "I'd like that," he said. "When were you thinking?" "Next month, maybe. I'll have the Westfield listing wrapped up by then, and you could use a break from the workshop." Nolan agreed, all while wondering what had prompted this sudden interest in reconnecting. Later that day, he received another call from Patricia. "I think I know why your wife suddenly wants a vacation," she said. "Bryant Nelson is in trouble. I've connected with a source from Meridian Properties. He left Chicago under suspicion of diverting client funds to personal accounts. Nothing was ever proven, but he departed with a confidential settlement agreement. Is he doing the same here?" Nolan asked. "That's where it gets interesting," Patricia continued. "Your brother-in-law, Dominic Caldwell, has been investing heavily in Bryant's local projects. They formed an LLC together that's purchasing commercial properties around Lakewood, properties that, coincidentally, your wife has been listing." The pieces were starting to fit together. Victoria's family hadn't just found a replacement for Nolan. They'd found a partner in whatever scheme Bryant was running, and Victoria was either complicit or being used herself. That evening, Nolan accessed Victoria's laptop while she showered. Her password had been their anniversary date for years. He quickly located folders containing details of the properties Bryant and Dominic had been purchasing. One document particularly caught his eye, a planning proposal that showed future development for land that hadn't yet been zoned for commercial use. Land that Preston Caldwell, as a city planning board member, would have influence over. When Victoria emerged from the shower, she found Nolan sitting in the living room, reading a woodworking magazine. "Thinking about that vacation," he said without looking up. "The lake sounds perfect." Victoria smiled, visibly relieved. "I'll start looking at dates." Nolan returned her smile, his mind already mapping the next moves in a game his opponents didn't realize they were playing. Chapter 4. Hidden Depths. A month had passed since Nolan's discovery of the family group chat. In that time, Patricia's investigation had yielded a treasure trove of information. Bryant Nelson wasn't just involved with Victoria. He was orchestrating a sophisticated property scheme with the Caldwells. They were purchasing undervalued commercial properties through shell companies, getting insider information on zoning changes from Preston's position on the planning board, and flipping them for substantial profits. Victoria's role was providing market analysis that deliberately undervalued properties to potential sellers while highlighting future potential to their private investment group. It wasn't technically illegal. It operated in a gray area of insider trading, but it certainly wasn't ethical. Nolan had spent the month meticulously collecting evidence while maintaining his facade of ignorance. He had secretly recorded conversations, photographed documents, and compiled a detailed timeline of their activities. Leonard had advised that while they were skirting legality, proving actual fraud would be difficult without more concrete evidence. "What they're doing isn't clean," Leonard had explained during their weekly meeting. "But Preston's influence provides plausible deniability. We need something more definitive." Nolan nodded, then revealed the next phase of his plan. Victoria mentioned that Preston is hosting a private investment gathering next weekend at their lake house. All the key players will be there, including several city officials. "I wasn't invited, of course." "That could be an opportunity," Leonard said thoughtfully. If they're pitching to new investors, they might reveal more than they should. Exactly what I was thinking, Nolan agreed. And I have just the way to listen in. The following day, Nolan visited a specialty electronics store 3 counties over, where he purchased several discrete recording devices. That evening, he told Victoria he'd be going on a fishing trip with some clients the weekend of her father's gathering. Perfect timing, Victoria said, relief evident in her voice. You would have been bored anyway. It's all business talk. I'm sure, Nolan replied with a knowing smile she couldn't interpret. 2 days before the investment gathering, Nolan received a call from Patricia. I found something you need to see immediately, she said, her voice tense. They met at a quiet diner off the highway. Patricia slid a folder across the table. Bryant Nelson isn't just running a property scheme, she explained. He's done this before in 3 different cities. Each time, he partners with a prominent local family, establishes investment groups, makes quick profits, then disappears when regulations start catching up. Nolan flipped through the documents, which detailed similar patterns in Chicago, Philadelphia, and Austin. That's not all, Patricia continued. In Chicago, the last family he partnered with, the Levinsons, ended up facing federal charges when the scheme collapsed. Bryant walked away clean. So he's setting up the Caldwells to take the fall, Nolan murmured. Exactly. And based on these transaction records, he's already moving money offshore. I'd say he's planning his exit strategy. Nolan considered this new information. Does Victoria know? Patricia hesitated. That's unclear. But I did find this. She pulled out her phone and showed Nolan text messages between Victoria and Bryant that had been recovered from a cloud backup. Victoria. How much longer do we need to keep this going? I'm tired of the charade. Bryant, just a few more months. Once the Riverside development closes, we'll have enough. Your family has served their purpose. Victoria and Nolan. Bryant, he'll get the settlement we discussed. Enough to keep his little woodshop running. He'll be fine. Nolan stared at the messages, a cold clarity washing over him. Victoria wasn't just cheating. She and Bryant were planning to cut out her own family once they'd served their purpose. The betrayal ran deeper than he'd imagined. This changes things, Nolan said finally. I need to adjust my approach. That night, as Victoria slept, Nolan placed one of his recording devices in her purse, carefully hidden in a side pocket she rarely used. He programmed it to activate with voice detection. The next morning, he kissed Victoria goodbye with unusual warmth. Have a good weekend at your father's gathering, he said. I'm looking forward to my fishing trip. Victoria seemed momentarily thrown by his enthusiasm, but quickly recovered. Catch something big for me, she said with a smile that now appeared hollow to Nolan's observant eyes. As soon as Victoria left, Nolan called Leonard. Change of plans, he said. I need to protect myself from becoming collateral damage in a much bigger scheme. Here's what we're going to do. Chapter 5, The Gathering Storm. The weekend of Preston Caldwell's investment gathering arrived with perfect weather, sunny skies, and a light breeze off the lake. Nolan had left home early that morning, ostensibly for his fishing trip. Victoria had been distracted during their goodbye, already mentally preparing for the important event. What Victoria didn't know was that Nolan had no intention of fishing. Instead, he drove to a rental cabin he'd secured just 2 miles from the Caldwell Lake house. From there, he could monitor the recording devices he'd strategically placed throughout the main gathering areas of the Caldwell property 3 days earlier, during a surprise visit to drop off a handcrafted serving tray, a thank you gift for Diane. By noon, the first guests began arriving at the Caldwell estate. Through his laptop, Nolan listened as Preston welcomed investors, city officials, and business partners. Bryant Nelson's smooth voice dominated many conversations, confidently outlining the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity their investment group offered. What sets our approach apart, Bryant explained to the assembled guests, is our ability to identify properties before they hit the market. Our analysis shows a projected return of 35% within 18 months on the Riverside project alone. An investor asked, "And the zoning issues I've heard about?" Preston's voice cut in smoothly. "Those concerns are greatly exaggerated. The Planning Commission supports development in that area. I can personally assure you of that." Nolan smiled grimly as he recorded everything. Preston was explicitly promising zoning changes based on his position, exactly the kind of statement that crossed from gray area into potentially actionable territory. The afternoon progressed with more damning conversations. Dominic outlined how their shell companies obscured ownership connections. Victoria presented market analyses that Nolan now recognized were deliberately manipulated. Around 4 o'clock, the recording captured a private conversation between Bryant and Victoria on the lake house patio. "Everything's going perfectly," Bryant said. "We'll close the final investors next week." "And then what?" Victoria asked. "My father thinks this is a long-term partnership." Bryant's laugh was cold. "That was never the plan, and you know it. 3 months from now, we'll be in Santorini, and the Caldwells will be managing the fallout when the Riverside Environmental Assessment comes back." "What environmental assessment?" Victoria's voice sharpened. "The one that's going to show contaminated groundwater from the old factory site," Bryant said casually. "The one that will tank property values after we've sold our positions." "You never mentioned that," Victoria said, her voice uncertain. "Need-to-know basis," Bryant replied dismissively. "Your family got what they wanted, quick profits. We get what we want, a clean exit. Everyone wins. Except the other investors," Victoria pointed out. "That's business," Bryant said. "Now about your husband. Have you talked to him about the divorce?" Victoria's sigh was audible. "Not yet. After the Riverside closing. One problem at a time." Nolan's hands tightened on his laptop. The recording continued as Bryant outlined how they would structure Victoria's exit from both her marriage and her family's business, taking a substantial portion of the profits with them. He was not only planning to betray the Caldwells, but had convinced Victoria to betray her own family. Later that evening, the most damning conversation occurred in Preston's study, where he, Dominic, Bryant, and 2 city officials discussed specific zoning changes in exchange for consulting fees. Nolan saved these recordings separately, immediately forwarding copies to Leonard. By Sunday afternoon, as the gathering wound down, Nolan had compiled enough evidence to bury everyone involved. But that wasn't his goal. Justice, in his mind, required a more nuanced approach than simple exposure. He called Patricia from his rental cabin. "I need one more piece of information," he explained. "Find out everything you can about the environmental situation at the Riverside property." Bryant mentioned contamination. "I need to know if that's real or fabricated." That evening, Nolan drove home, arriving shortly before Victoria. When she walked in, he was preparing dinner, looking relaxed and refreshed from his fishing trip. "How was the gathering?" he asked casually. "Productive," Victoria replied, setting down her bag. "How was fishing?" "Enlightening," Nolan said with a smile. "Sometimes you think you're after one thing, but you end up catching something entirely different." Victoria gave him a curious look, but didn't press for elaboration. The next morning, Patricia called with her findings on the Riverside property. "The contamination is real," she confirmed. Tests from 5 years ago showed elevated levels of industrial chemicals, but the report was buried. Bryant somehow got access to it, probably through his connections at the environmental agency. "So he's planning to buy low, sell high to their investors, then leak the environmental report after they've cashed out," Nolan summarized. "Exactly," Patricia agreed. "And from what I can tell, neither the Caldwells nor any of their investors know about this risk." "Perfect," Nolan said quietly. "That's exactly what I needed to know." That afternoon, Nolan visited Leonard's office with all the evidence he'd gathered over the weekend. "We have enough to approach the SEC and possibly the FBI," Leonard said after reviewing everything. "This crosses several legal boundaries." "Not yet," Nolan replied. "I have a different approach in mind." He outlined his plan, not one of public exposure or legal prosecution, but of strategic leverage. Leonard listened carefully, occasionally raising legal concerns that Nolan addressed with surprising thoroughness. "It's risky," Leonard said finally, "but if executed correctly, it achieves your goals without the unpredictability of a public legal battle." "Exactly," Nolan agreed. "They've underestimated me for years. Let them continue thinking I'm oblivious until the moment I'm not." As Nolan left Leonard's office, he felt the first real sense of control since discovering the group chat a month earlier. The Invisible Man was about to become very visible indeed. Chapter 6, Counter-Moves. The following week marked a turning point in Nolan's carefully orchestrated response. With Patricia and Leonard's help, he had compiled a comprehensive understanding of the Caldwell-Nelson scheme, including its weaknesses and pressure points. On Tuesday morning, Nolan made his first move. He called Dominic Caldwell directly, something he rarely did. "Dominic, I hope I'm not interrupting," he began pleasantly when his brother-in-law answered. "Nolan," Dominic sounded genuinely surprised. "What can I do for you?" "I've been thinking about your father's suggestion to diversify my business investments," Nolan explained. "I'm interested in learning more about the opportunities Bryant mentioned." A brief silence followed before Dominic responded cautiously. "I didn't realize you were looking to invest. I've saved more than Victoria probably realizes," Nolan said with a light chuckle. "Craftsmen tend to be frugal. I like to put some of it to work." "Of course," Dominic said, his tone warming considerably. "Why don't you come by my office tomorrow? We can discuss possibilities." After ending the call, Nolan contacted Leonard. "First meeting set. Are the documents ready?" "Everything is requested," Leonard confirmed. "What are you sure about this approach?" "It puts you in their crosshairs." "That's exactly where I need to be," Nolan replied. That evening, Victoria arrived home later than usual, looking distracted. "Everything okay?" Nolan asked as they prepared dinner together. Victoria hesitated before answering. "Just work stress. The Riverside development is becoming more complicated than expected. Anything I can help with?" Nolan offered. "No," Victoria said quickly, then softened her tone. "But thanks. Actually, Dominic mentioned you called him about investing." Nolan nodded casually. "I've been thinking about what your father said at dinner. Maybe it's time I look beyond the workshop for financial growth." Victoria studied him with an unreadable expression. "That's surprisingly open-minded of you. How much are you thinking of investing?" "I have about $350,000 available," Nolan replied, watching Victoria's eyes widen slightly. "I had no idea you had those kinds of savings," she said. Nolan shrugged. "My grandfather's influence. He always said to keep a portion of earnings untouched. It adds up over 15 years. Later that night, Nolan monitored the recording device in Victoria's purse as she made a call from her car to Bryant. "He has $350,000 in savings," Victoria was saying. "He wants to invest in Riverside." "Perfect timing," Bryant replied. "We could use additional capital before closing." "Bring him in. It actually simplifies things for later." "What do you mean?" Victoria asked. "If he's financially involved, the divorce settlement becomes cleaner," Bryant explained. "His investment goes bad. You offer a clean break with no claims on his business assets. Everyone walks away thinking they got what they wanted." Nolan listened impassively. Their plan to use his investment as a simplification for the divorce proceedings only reinforced his resolve. The next day, Nolan met with Dominic at his sleek downtown office. Bryant joined them halfway through, bringing slick presentation materials on the Riverside development. "The opportunity here is truly exceptional," Bryant explained, showing projected returns that Nolan now knew were based on manipulated data. "We're offering this to a very select group of investors." "It certainly looks impressive," Nolan commented, studying the materials with apparent interest. "And you're confident about the zoning changes?" "Absolutely," Dominic assured him. "The Planning Commission vote is next month, but it's essentially a formality. And the property itself, any environmental concerns?" Nolan asked innocently. "I read something about the old factory that used to be there." Bryant's expression flickered momentarily before his smooth facade returned. "All standard assessments have been completed. Nothing of concern." "Wonderful," Nolan said, producing a check from his pocket. "Then I'd like to invest the full $350,000. Both Dominic and Bryant looked momentarily stunned by his immediate decision. "Don't you want to discuss this with Victoria first?" Dominic asked. Nolan smiled. "Victoria and I have always maintained some financial independence. She has her real estate. I have my furniture. This is my decision." He slid the check across the table along with investor paperwork Leonard had prepared. "I've taken the liberty of reviewing your standard investor agreement. I had a few small modifications noted in the attached addendum." Bryant skimmed the addendum, which appear to contain only minor clarifications about reporting and distribution timing. "This all seems reasonable," he said, glancing at Dominic, who nodded in agreement. They signed the papers, and Nolan left with copies of everything, including his investor ID for the Riverside Development Partners, LLC. What neither Bryant nor Dominic realized was that the innocuous-looking addendum Leonard had prepared contained carefully worded clauses that would prove crucial later. It specified Nolan's right to independently verify all property assessments and his ability to request full financial disclosures at any time, rights that standard investors in their scheme didn't possess. That evening, Victoria was unusually attentive when Nolan returned home. "How did the meeting with Dominic go?" she asked, pouring him a glass of wine. "Very well," Nolan replied. "I've invested in the Riverside development." Victoria nodded, trying to appear casually supportive. "That's a big step for you. I know how conservative you usually are with money. Sometimes change is necessary," Nolan said meaningfully. "I've been too comfortable for too long." The conversation shifted to dinner plans, but Nolan noticed Victoria texting frequently throughout the evening. The next morning, Patricia called with news. Bryant Nelson has accelerated some of his plans. He's listed his house with a different real estate agency and booked flights to Greece for next month. Earlier than they planned, Nolan noted. "They must be spooked by something." "There's more," Patricia continued. "I've been monitoring their investors. 3 major backers pulled out yesterday after receiving anonymous information packets about potential contamination issues at Riverside." Nolan smiled. This was the work of Leonard, who had discreetly reached out to select investors with just enough information to cause concern without revealing their larger strategy. "Perfect," Nolan said. "Now they'll be desperate for my investment to fill the gap." The following week, Nolan received an invitation from Preston Caldwell to join a small strategy dinner at his home. Victoria seemed surprised when Nolan showed her the invitation. "Dad rarely includes spouses in business discussions," she remarked. "Perhaps my investment changed his perspective," Nolan suggested. The dinner proved illuminating. Preston, Dominic, Bryant, and 2 other investors discussed the Riverside timeline with increasing urgency. The Planning Commission vote had been unexpectedly delayed by 2 weeks due to administrative concerns. "This shouldn't affect our timeline significantly," Preston assured everyone. "My contacts on the commission have guaranteed their support." Nolan listened attentively, asking occasional questions that appeared naive but were carefully designed to elicit specific responses about timeframes and commitments. By the end of the evening, he had a complete picture of their accelerated exit strategy. As they drove home, Victoria seemed tense. "You were asking a lot of questions tonight. Just trying to understand my investment better," Nolan replied easily. "It's a lot of money for me." Victoria placed her hand on his arm. "I know, and I appreciate you trusting my family with it. It means a lot." The genuine seeming gratitude in her voice might once have moved him. Now, knowing her true intentions, Nolan only felt a calm determination as he covered her hand with his own. "Family is important," he said simply. "You never know how much you can trust them until they're tested." Victoria nodded absently, unaware of the weight behind his words or how soon that test would come. Chapter 7. The Reversal. 2 weeks after Nolan's investment in the Riverside development, cracks began appearing in the Caldwell-Nelson operation. The Planning Commission vote had been delayed again, this time indefinitely, citing new information requiring further study. Preston's influence had mysteriously failed to expedite the process. Victoria had grown increasingly agitated, spending long hours in hushed phone conversations with Bryant and her family. Nolan maintained his facade of oblivious support, occasionally asking innocent questions about the delays that only heightened Victoria's tension. On a Wednesday morning, Nolan received an email from the Riverside Development Partners, LLC, announcing an emergency investor meeting that evening. Victoria hadn't mentioned it, which confirmed his suspicion that she was deliberately keeping him in the dark about the growing problems. "Is everything okay with the Riverside project?" he asked casually over breakfast. "I haven't heard much lately." Victoria's smile was strained. "Just bureaucratic delays. Nothing to worry about." "Good to hear," Nolan replied, not mentioning the emergency meeting. I'm working late at the shop tonight. Large commission piece deadline. Victoria's relief was palpable. I'll probably be late too. Client dinner. That evening, Nolan arrived at the investor meeting in a conservative suit that made him almost unrecognizable from his usual workshop attire. He took a seat at the back of the conference room as Preston, Dominic, and Bryant attempted to project confidence despite the obvious tension. As you all know, we've encountered some unexpected regulatory hurdles, Bryant began, his usual smoothness undercut by a slight edge in his voice. However, we want to assure everyone that these are temporary setbacks. An investor in the front row spoke up. We've heard rumors about environmental concerns. Is there any truth to that? Absolutely not. Preston interjected firmly. Those rumors are baseless and potentially libelous. Our environmental assessments are completely clean. Nolan raised his hand, drawing surprised looks from those who recognized Victoria's usually quiet husband. Mr. Pierce, Bryant acknowledged with a tight smile. You have a question? I do, Nolan said, his voice steady. According to Section 12 of our investor agreement, we're entitled to review all property assessments. I like to see the environmental reports myself. Bryant and Preston exchanged glances before Dominic stepped forward. Of course, we can provide those. Though I'm surprised by your concern, given your family connection. Just due diligence, Nolan replied calmly. Which brings me to my second question. I understand 3 major investors withdrew 2 weeks ago. Has that capital been replaced? The room grew quiet as other investors leaned forward with renewed interest. We've secured alternative funding, Bryant claimed, though his expression betrayed uncertainty. Excellent, Nolan continued. Then the project remains on solid financial footing despite the Planning Commission delays. Before Bryant could respond, the conference room door opened and Leonard Russo walked in with a portfolio under his arm. I apologize for the interruption, Leonard said, walking directly to Nolan. Mr. Pierce, the documents you requested. Nolan accepted the portfolio with a nod. Thank you, Leonard. Perfect timing. Bryant attempted to regain control of the meeting. If we could return to the presentation. Actually, Nolan interrupted, rising from his seat. I have information relevant to everyone here. He opened the portfolio and distributed copies of a document to nearby investors, who passed them around. This is an environmental assessment of the Riverside property conducted 5 years ago that was never publicly filed. It shows significant groundwater contamination from the previous factory operation. Remediation costs are estimated at $4 to $6 million. The room erupted in concerned murmurs as investors examined the report. Bryant's face hardened. Where did you get that document? It's not official. It's verified by the state environmental agency. Nolan replied, holding up another document. As is this more recent assessment from last month, confirming the contamination persists. I commissioned it myself under the independent verification clause in my investor agreement. Preston Caldwell stood, his authoritative presence momentarily silencing the room. This meeting is adjourned while we review this new information. Please, everyone remain calm. We'll reconvene tomorrow after we've had a chance to examine these claims. As investors filed out, many already on phones with their attorneys, Nolan remained seated. Preston, Dominic, and Bryant approached him, faces tight with barely controlled fury. What the hell do you think you're doing? Dominic demanded. Due diligence, Nolan replied simply. Something you should have done before bringing investors into a contaminated property scheme. This is a family matter now, Preston said, his voice dangerously low. We'll discuss this privately. By all means, Nolan agreed, standing to gather his materials. Though you should know that Victoria isn't coming home tonight. Her client dinner is actually with Bryant at his lake house. They've been planning their exit strategy from the development, from her family, and from me, for months. The shock on Preston and Dominic's faces confirmed they had been unaware of Victoria and Bryant's separate betrayal. You're lying, Dominic managed, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. Am I? Nolan asked, pulling out his phone and playing a recorded conversation between Victoria and Bryant, discussing their plans to leave the country with their share of investor funds before the contamination report became public. Preston's face had gone ashen. You've been investigating us. For over a month, Nolan confirmed. Ever since I found a family group chat on Victoria's old phone. The one where you all discussed how pathetic I am and how I'll be replaced soon with someone better. Recognition and shock crossed their faces. That was private family communication, Preston said stiffly. Indeed, Nolan agreed. And now you understand how private betrayal feels. He handed each of them a business card for Leonard Russo. My attorney will be in touch tomorrow with terms. I suggest you don't make any travel plans in the meantime. As Nolan walked to the door, Dominic called after him. Terms? What terms? Nolan turned back with a calm smile. The terms under which I don't take everything I've discovered to the SEC, the FBI, and every investor you've defrauded. The terms under which you get to salvage something from this disaster you've created. With that, he left them standing in the conference room, their perfectly constructed scheme collapsing around them. Chapter 8. Confrontations. The morning after the investor meeting, Victoria returned home looking exhausted and tense. She found Nolan sitting at the kitchen table, calmly drinking coffee and reading the newspaper. You're up early, she commented, setting down her purse. The same one containing the recording device that had captured her late-night conversation with Bryant after they'd learned of the disastrous investor meeting. Important day, Nolan replied without looking up. How was your client dinner? Victoria hesitated. Fine. Just long. We had a lot to discuss. I'm sure you did, Nolan agreed, finally folding the newspaper and meeting her eyes. Bryant must be quite upset about the investor meeting. Victoria froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. What investor meeting? The emergency one last night, Nolan explained conversationally, where I shared the environmental report on Riverside with everyone. The cup slipped from Victoria's fingers, shattering on the floor. She didn't move to clean it up, her eyes fixed on Nolan's calm face. How did you? She began, then stopped herself. Know about the meeting? Or about the contamination? Nolan asked. Or about your affair with Bryant? Or about your plan to leave the country with investor money before the scheme collapsed? Victoria's face drained of color. You've been spying on me. I prefer to call it due diligence, Nolan corrected, using the same phrase from the meeting. After finding your family's group chat where you all discussed replacing me with someone better, I became curious about exactly what was happening. Victoria's expression shifted from shock to calculation. Nolan, whatever you think you know. I know everything, Victoria, he interrupted gently. Every conversation, every plan, every betrayal. I have recordings, documents, witness statements. I know about Bryant's history of running this same scheme in other cities. I know about your father's planning commission influence. I know about Dominic's shell companies. Victoria sank into a chair. What do you want? Interesting question, Nolan mused. What does the invisible man want when he suddenly becomes visible? Justice, I suppose. Not revenge. That's too simple. Justice requires balance. Money, Victoria asked bluntly. Is that what this is about? Nolan laughed softly. I have money. More than you knew about. The cabin on Lakeview Road that my grandfather left me, I've been renting it out for 15 years. The trust fund he established, I've never touched the principal. While you all thought I was just a simple furniture maker getting by, I was quite comfortable. Then what? Victoria demanded, frustration breaking through her composure. Consequences, Nolan answered simply. For 15 years, I loved you and your family, despite the subtle digs, the condescension, the dismissal of my work. I defended you all, believed in you. And all along, you were just using me until someone better came along. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden he'd cultivated for years. Leonard Russo, my attorney, is meeting with your father and brother right now. They're discussing the terms under which I don't pursue legal action for fraud, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges. You would destroy your own family? Victoria asked incredulously. Nolan turned back to her, his expression hardening. My family? The one that called me pathetic? The one that planned to discard me? That's not family, Victoria. That's a business arrangement that's reached its termination point. Victoria's phone buzzed repeatedly. She glanced at it to see multiple missed calls from her father, brother, and Bryant. You should probably answer that, Nolan suggested. They'll be wanting to discuss damage control. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Nolan checked his watch. Right on time. He opened the door to reveal Patricia Winters standing on the porch with a professional-looking woman Nolan introduced as Meredith Zhao, a federal investigator. Ms. Caldwell, Meredith said formally, I'm with the Securities and Exchange Commission. We'd like to ask you some questions about Riverside Development Partners, LLC. Victoria looked from the investigator to Nolan, disbelief evident in her expression. You actually called the authorities? No, Nolan corrected. I provided evidence to them when they contacted me. It seems someone else reported concerns about the development. One of the investors you tried to defraud, perhaps? Ms. Zhao is here as a courtesy to allow you to make a voluntary statement before formal proceedings begin. Victoria's phone buzzed again. This time she answered, listening for a few moments before saying, He's turned us in to the SEC. There's an investigator at our house right now. After another pause, she added, Yes, I'll come right over. Hanging up, she faced Nolan with cold fury. My father wants to meet with you. He says there's a solution that can work for everyone. I'm sure he does, Nolan replied evenly. After you speak with Ms. Zhao, you're welcome to join us. I believe Leonard and I have a very reasonable proposal for how this ends. As Victoria moved to follow the investigator into the living room, she paused beside Nolan. I never thought you had this in you, she said quietly. All these years, I underestimated you. Everyone did, Nolan agreed. That was your mistake. 3 hours later, Nolan sat in Preston Caldwell's study, facing Victoria's father across his imposing mahogany desk. Dominic paced by the window, while Leonard Russo sat calmly beside Nolan, reviewing documents. Victoria and Brian had been asked to wait in the living room, a strategic decision to separate the conspirators during negotiations. This is blackmail, Preston stated flatly, gesturing to the proposal Leonard had presented. No, Leonard corrected politely. Blackmail would involve threatening to expose information for personal gain. This is a settlement offer to avoid litigation that would certainly result in criminal charges, financial ruin, and public humiliation for everyone involved. You want controlling interest in all Caldwell development properties, Dominic interjected angrily. At fair market value, accounting for the actual conditions of those properties, Nolan pointed out, including the contamination costs for Riverside that you concealed. And you want Victoria to publicly file for divorce, citing her infidelity. Preston continued, reading from the document. With a settlement already outlined, that's more than generous, Leonard noted. Nolan retains all his separate property and business assets. Victoria keeps her personal accounts and receives a one-time payment of $100,000. No further claims on either side. Preston leaned back in his chair, studying Nolan with new respect and barely disguised hatred. And if we refuse? Leonard slid forward a USB drive. Then this goes to the SEC, FBI, every investor in your schemes, and every business contact you have. You'll face federal charges, civil lawsuits, and the complete destruction of the Caldwell name and legacy. Silence hung in the room as Preston and Dominic absorbed the gravity of their situation. Why not just turn us in? Dominic finally asked. Why this elaborate negotiation? Nolan answered directly. Because despite everything, Victoria was my wife for 15 years. Because public scandal helps no one. Because I don't want destruction. I want justice and a clean separation. Preston studied Nolan for a long moment before speaking. You've outplayed us all, haven't you? The simple furniture maker. The invisible man we never really saw. You saw what you wanted to see, Nolan replied without rancor. You created this situation by underestimating me, using me, planning to discard me. Now you face the consequences. Preston reached for a pen, his hand steady despite the circumstances. And Bryant Nelson? What happens to him in this arrangement? Nothing from me, Nolan said. But Ms. Zhao has a separate investigation into his previous schemes in other cities. I believe he'll have his own consequences to face. As Preston prepared to sign the documents, Nolan added, one more thing. I want access to the family group chat, as an observer only. No need to include me in conversations. I just want to see what you all say about this situation when you think I'm not listening. Dominic protested. That's non-negotiable, Nolan interrupted firmly. Consider it my insurance policy. Preston nodded slowly, then signed the documents. Dominic followed reluctantly, his signature sharp and angry on the page. I'll have Victoria and Bryant come in now to review their portions, Leonard suggested, gathering the sign papers. As they waited, Preston asked quietly, How long have you known? About the group chat? Just over a month, Nolan replied. About the affair? 3 weeks. About the property scheme? 2 weeks. It's amazing what people reveal when they think no one is paying attention. Preston's gaze was calculating. You never struck me as ruthless. I'm not ruthless, Nolan corrected. I'm just finally visible. Chapter 9, New Beginnings. 6 months after the confrontation at the Caldwell estate, Nolan stood in his expanded workshop, surveying the changes. The settlement had allowed him to purchase the adjacent property, doubling his workspace and adding a small showroom for his custom furniture pieces. His client list had grown as his reputation for exceptional craftsmanship spread beyond Lakewood. The divorce had been finalized 3 months earlier, with surprisingly little public drama. Victoria had adhered to the agreement, filing on grounds of infidelity and accepting the predetermined settlement. She had moved to Chicago shortly after, alone. Bryant Nelson had fled to Greece as planned, only to be detained by authorities working with American investigators. He now faced charges in 3 states for his property schemes. The Caldwell family had managed to avoid criminal charges, thanks to the structured settlement Nolan and Leonard had orchestrated, but their reputation had suffered. Preston had resigned from the Planning Commission, citing health concerns. Dominic had closed his venture capital firm and moved to the West Coast to start over. Riverside Development Partners LLC had been dissolved, with Nolan using his controlling interest to implement a proper environmental remediation plan for the contaminated property. Once cleaned, he'd worked with legitimate developers to create a mixed-use community that included affordable housing units and a public woodworking school, a personal project he'd always wanted to pursue. Leonard entered the workshop, admiring a cherry dining table Nolan was completing for a client in Boston. Beautiful work, he commented, running his hand along the smooth surface. Thanks, Nolan replied. How did the final transfer go? Smoothly, Leonard confirmed. The last Caldwell property has been sold to the investment group as planned. Your controlling interest netted a very healthy profit. Nolan nodded thoughtfully. And the community center renovations? On schedule, Leonard assured him. The woodworking school should be ready to accept students by spring. They moved to Nolan's office, where a simple lunch awaited them. As they ate, Leonard mentioned casually, Victoria contacted me yesterday. Nolan looked up, surprised. What did she want? To amend the divorce agreement, Leonard explained. She's struggling financially in Chicago. It seems her real estate license there isn't generating the income she expected without her family connections. And Nolan prompted, his expression neutral. And I reminded her of the non-modification clause in your agreement, Leonard said. She wasn't pleased. Nolan considered this information. Has she been added back to the family group chat? Leonard smiled slightly. Yes, about 2 months ago. They've been quite frank in their discussions about the situation. Since the settlement, Nolan had maintained his access to the Caldwell family group chat as stipulated in their agreement. He rarely checked it now, having moved beyond the need for that particular window into their lives. Anything interesting? He asked. Preston blamed her for everything. Of course, Leonard reported. Dominic suggested she find another furniture maker to bankroll her. They're not exactly a supportive bunch. Nolan nodded, unsurprised. And have they mentioned me recently? Not by name, Leonard said. They refer to you as the woodworker or, occasionally, the invisible man with a certain bitterness. I think they've finally recognized what they lost by underestimating you. After lunch, Leonard departed, leaving Nolan alone in his workshop. He returned to the cherry dining table, applying a final coat of finish with careful, deliberate strokes. The work centered him, as it always had. His phone buzzed with a message from Patricia. Riverside remediation officially complete. Environmental agency signed off this morning. Congratulations. He smiled, setting down his brush to respond with thanks. As evening approached, Nolan locked up the workshop and walked to his truck. He drove not to the house he'd shared with Victoria. He'd sold that months ago, but to his grandfather's cabin on Lakeview Road. He'd renovated it personally, turning it into the home he'd always wanted but Victoria had never embraced. Entering the cabin, he was greeted by the scent of cooking. Amelie Henderson, the environmental lawyer who had helped navigate the Riverside remediation, looked up from the stove and smiled. "Perfect timing," she said. "Dinner's almost ready." They had met during the cleanup project, her passionate commitment to environmental justice aligning with his determination to right the wrongs of the Riverside development. Their professional relationship had gradually evolved into something more, built on mutual respect and genuine appreciation. "How was your day?" she asked as they settled at the dining table, one he'd crafted specifically for this space. "Productive," Nolan replied, pouring wine for them both. "The Boston Commission is nearly complete, and the remediation at Riverside got final approval." "That's wonderful," Amelie said warmly. "You've turned that disaster into something truly positive for the community." After dinner, they sat on the cabin's porch overlooking the lake, the same lake where the Caldwell estate stood several miles around the shore, now sold to new owners. "I saw an interesting message in the family chat today," Nolan mentioned. "Victoria's struggling in Chicago." Amelie studied his expression in the fading light. "How does that make you feel?" Nolan considered the question carefully. Not satisfied exactly. Not vindicated. Just at peace with how things have unfolded. "Everyone is facing the natural consequences of their choices, including me." "Do you regret any of it?" Amelie asked. "Not the outcome," Nolan said thoughtfully. "Though perhaps I regret not seeing things clearly sooner. I spent years being invisible because it was easier than demanding recognition. And now," Amelie prompted. "Now I'm exactly where I should be," Nolan said, reaching for her hand. "Visible to those who matter, invisible to those who don't. On my own terms." As darkness settled over the lake, Nolan reflected on the journey of the past year. He had transformed from the invisible man, taken for granted, underestimated, nearly discarded, into someone who had claimed his rightful place in his own life. Not through brutality or cruelty, but through clear-eyed justice and the courage to be seen. Inside his jacket pocket was a small wooden box he'd crafted over the past month. The same intricate box with hidden compartments he'd begun the night he discovered the family chat. Now it held a different purpose. Inside was a ring, carefully designed and crafted by his own hands. He would ask Amelie tomorrow, he decided, not because he needed someone to complete him or validate him, but because he wanted to share his visible life with someone who had truly seen him from the beginning. The invisible man had stepped into the light, finally becoming the author of his own story. Epilogue, 15 years later. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Pierce Woodworking Academy, casting warm patterns across the polished maple floors. Nolan Pierce, now 57 with distinguished silver temples framing his otherwise dark hair, moved between the workbenches where 12 students focused intently on their projects. The school's reputation had grown steadily over 15 years, attracting aspiring craftspeople from across the country. What had begun as a modest community project on the remediated Riverside property had evolved into one of the most respected furniture-making institutions in the Midwest. "Remember," Nolan said, pausing beside a young woman working on a complex joinery technique, "the wood will tell you when it's ready. You can't rush craftsmanship." The student nodded earnestly, adjusting her approach with more patience. Nolan smiled, seeing himself from decades ago in her determination. Teaching had become as fulfilling as creating his own pieces, perhaps more so. His custom furniture still commanded premium prices and lengthy waiting lists, but he now limited his personal commissions to 4 major pieces per year, devoting most of his energy to the school and its students. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from Amelie. "Don't forget, dinner with Maya's family at 7. She has big news." Nolan smiled, typing back, "Wouldn't miss it." Finishing up the faculty meeting by 6. Maya Henderson Pierce, their daughter, had recently completed her first year of law school, following in her mother's footsteps while maintaining her father's passion for environmental causes. At 14, She represented the greatest joy of Nolan and Amelie's life together, a family neither had expected to have at that stage of their lives. He remembered proposing to Amelie with a handcrafted wooden box holding the ring he'd made, just a day after their conversation about Victoria's struggles. Amelie had said yes immediately, and they'd married 6 months later in a small ceremony by the lake. Maya had arrived 2 years after that, surprising them both with the possibility of parenthood they'd thought might have passed them by. Finishing his rounds with the students, Nolan retreated to his office to handle administrative matters before the faculty meeting. The Pierce Woodworking Academy now employed 6 full-time instructors, all master craftspeople in their own right, along with visiting artisans who taught specialized workshops throughout the year. His office remained a testament to his journey. The walls adorned with photographs of significant commissions, award from the Furniture Guild, and a small shelf displaying the very first pieces he'd created under his grandfather's tutelage. But the most prominent item was a large framed photograph of the complete Riverside development, as seen from above. The mixed-use community, affordable housing complex, public green spaces, and the woodworking school at its center. What had once been a contaminated industrial site manipulated for fraud had become a nationally recognized model for community-oriented urban renewal. As Nolan reviewed the upcoming semester's curriculum, his computer chimed with an email notification. The subject line read, Annual Riverside Community Foundation Report. The foundation had been established 10 years earlier to manage the profits from the commercial elements of the development, channeling them into scholarships for both the woodworking school and other educational initiatives in Lakewood. Nolan served as chairman emeritus, having stepped back from active management 5 years ago to focus on teaching and his family. The report showed continued growth in both assets and community impact, another testament to the positive legacy that had emerged from the Caldwell-Nelson scheme's ashes. Nolan allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before turning to his faculty meeting notes. Across town, in the sleek downtown offices of Henderson Environmental Law, Amelie Pierce, she had kept Henderson professionally, concluded a conference call with EPA officials regarding a major corporate compliance case. At 53, she had built her firm into one of the region's premier environmental practices, with 8 attorneys and a reputation for both technical excellence and unwavering integrity. After ending the call, she opened her desk drawer and removed a small framed photograph, their family at Maya's high school graduation 2 years earlier. Nolan stood tall and proud, his arm around Amelie, while Maya beamed between them, valedictorian cords draped over her graduation gown. The photograph reminded Amelie of how unexpectedly rich her life had become after meeting Nolan during the Riverside remediation project. She sometimes marveled at how different their family dynamic was from what Nolan had experienced with Victoria and the Caldwells. Where they had diminished him, made him invisible, Amelie had always seen his quiet strength and depth. Their relationship had been founded on mutual respect that had deepened into profound love and partnership over 15 years. Her assistant knocked lightly on the door. "Your 3 o'clock is here, Leonard Russo." Amelie smiled. "Send him in." Leonard, now 70 with a full head of white hair and the same sharp eyes, entered with a leather portfolio under his arm. Though technically retired from full-time practice, he still handled select matters for long-time clients, including the Pierce family. "How's my favorite environmental crusader?" he asked, settling into a chair. "Busy as always," Amelie replied warmly. "How was your Mediterranean cruise?" "Educational," Leonard said with a wink. "Though I may have spent more time sampling local wines than historical sites. But that's not why I'm here." He placed the portfolio on her desk and opened it to reveal legal documents. "The final paperwork on the Victoria Caldwell matter. I wanted to deliver these personally." Amelie's expression grew serious as she examined the papers. "So, she's really going through with it?" Leonard nodded. "After all these years, I must admit, I never expected this particular development." 3 hours later, in an upscale restaurant in Lakewood's revitalized downtown district, Nolan and Amelie sat across from Maya and her boyfriend, Thomas, listening as their daughter shared her news. "I've been offered a clerkship with Justice Ramirez on the state Supreme Court after graduation," Maya announced, her eyes shining with excitement. It's a 2-year position, and afterward, Thomas and I are thinking of starting our own practice focusing on environmental justice cases. Thomas, a third-year law student with a background in environmental science, nodded enthusiastically. We want to combine litigation with community advocacy, inspired by both of you, actually. Nolan reached across the table to squeeze his daughter's hand. I'm incredibly proud of you, Maya. Not just for your achievements, but for your vision. Your grandfather would have been proud too. Thanks, Dad, Maya said softly. After a moment, she added, there's something else we wanted to tell you. Thomas reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. We're engaged. I asked Maya last night, and she said yes. Amelie's eyes filled with tears of joy as she embraced her daughter, while Nolan shook Thomas's hand firmly before pulling him into a hug. Welcome to the family, Nolan said sincerely. Though I have to ask, did you make the ring yourself? Because that's something of a tradition. Thomas laughed. No, but I designed it with a jeweler who specializes in ethical sourcing. I figured that was in the spirit of things. As they celebrated with champagne, Nolan felt a deep contentment. This moment, his family expanding, his daughter forging her own path built on values he and Amelie shared, represented everything he had built in the 15 years since his life had been upended by betrayal. The following afternoon, Nolan drove to Lakeview Cemetery, a small bouquet of wildflowers in the passenger seat. The annual visit had become a personal ritual, one that Amelie respected by giving him this time alone. He parked near the peaceful grove where his grandfather's headstone stood, simple and dignified like the man himself. Nolan placed the flowers at its base and stood quietly for a few moments. Maya's engaged, he said finally. You would have liked Thomas. He reminds me of you in some ways, thoughtful, principled. After paying his respects, Nolan walked to another section of the cemetery, stopping before a much newer granite marker. Diane Caldwell, beloved mother and grandmother. Victoria's mother had passed away 7 years earlier after a brief battle with cancer. Nolan had attended the funeral discreetly, standing at the back of the service. Not out of malice or a desire to intrude, but because despite everything, Diane had been his mother-in-law for 15 years. The past couldn't be erased, only reconciled and integrated into the full tapestry of one's life. As Nolan turned to leave, he noticed a slender figure approaching from the opposite direction. He recognized her immediately, despite the years, Victoria. She saw him at the same moment and hesitated briefly before continuing forward. At 57, Victoria Caldwell still maintained the polished appearance she had always valued, though her face now showed the lines of time and experience. They stood on opposite sides of her mother's grave, the first time they had been face-to-face in nearly 15 years. Nolan, she said finally, her voice softer than he remembered. I didn't expect to see you here. I come every year, he replied simply. She was family, regardless of how things ended. Victoria nodded, a complexity of emotions crossing her features. Leonard told Amelie about my request. I assume? Yes, it's been discussed. After her move to Chicago had failed to provide the fresh start she'd hoped for, Victoria had eventually relocated to Seattle, where she had slowly rebuilt her real estate career. Over the years, she had occasionally contacted Leonard about modifying aspects of the divorce agreement, but had never pursued any claims legally. The most recent contact, however, had been different. Victoria had reached out not to request financial adjustments, but to express a desire to make amends, beginning with a substantial donation to the scholarship fund at Pierce Woodworking Academy. I wasn't sure you'd accept it, Victoria said, looking down at her mother's grave rather than at Nolan. I would understand if you didn't. It's not about me, Nolan replied. The foundation benefits students who might not otherwise have access to education. Their opportunities shouldn't be limited by our history. Victoria nodded. After a moment of silence, she asked, Is it true that Dominic reached out to you last year? Yes, Nolan confirmed. He wanted advice on starting over. Dominic Caldwell's move to the West Coast had initially seemed to promise a fresh start, but old habits had proven difficult to break. A series of questionable business ventures had eventually resulted in fraud charges. After serving 18 months in a minimum security facility, Dominic had found himself starting truly from scratch, his reputation and resources depleted. And you helped him, Victoria stated rather than asked. After everything, Nolan shrugged slightly. I helped him find legitimate work with a furniture importer who needed someone with business experience. The rest was up to him. Victoria studied him with newfound perspective. You've changed, Nolan. Or maybe you haven't. Maybe this is who you always were, and we just refuse to see it. People are always more than the single dimension others assign them, Nolan replied. That's something I learned from our marriage, for better and worse. They stood in silence for another moment before Victoria spoke again. I heard about Maya's clerkship. Congratulations. She seems remarkable. She is, Nolan agreed, surprised that Victoria kept tabs on his family. What did you hear about it? The legal community is smaller than it seems. My husband is an attorney in Seattle. This was news to Nolan. I didn't know you had remarried. Victoria nodded. 8 years ago, Robert specialized in real estate law initially. We met during a complex transaction. He's a good man, more patient than I deserved at that point in my life. I'm glad, Nolan said sincerely. Everyone deserves a chance to build something meaningful. Victoria smiled faintly. That sounds like forgiveness. Not exactly, Nolan clarified. Forgiveness implies forgetting, and I haven't forgotten. But I've moved beyond letting those memories define my present or future. There's a difference. Victoria nodded in understanding. And my father? Have you moved beyond with him as well? Preston Caldwell had never recovered from the collapse of his reputation and influence in Lakewood. After his resignation from the Planning Commission, he had attempted to rebuild his development business in a neighboring state, but had struggled to establish the same connections and leverage he had once enjoyed. Reports suggested he now lived modestly in a retirement community in Arizona, his ambitions finally tempered by age and circumstance. I have no quarrel with Preston anymore, Nolan said. The past is settled. Victoria glanced at her watch. I should go. My flight back to Seattle leaves in a few hours. I just wanted to pay my respects while I was in town for the real estate conference. She hesitated, then added, the donation to the scholarship fund. It's not about easing my conscience, though I won't pretend that isn't part of it. It's about contributing to something meaningful that will outlast all our mistakes. Nolan nodded. I understand. Leonard will finalize the arrangements. As Victoria turned to leave, she paused. Whatever became of Bryant? Bryant Nelson had faced multiple charges in different jurisdictions after his scheme unraveled. He had served 4 years in federal prison before being released on parole. Attempts to trace his whereabouts afterward had yielded little information. He seemed to have finally learned the value of keeping a low profile. Last I heard, he was working as a sales manager for a timeshare company in Florida, Nolan replied. Under a different name. Victoria shook her head slightly. Some people never really change. And some do, Nolan countered. That's what makes life interesting. With a final nod of acknowledgement, Victoria walked away, her figure growing smaller as she followed the cemetery path toward the parking area. Nolan remained for a few minutes longer, reflecting on the unexpected encounter. 15 years ago, seeing Victoria would have stirred anger, hurt, or at least tension. Today, he felt only a calm acknowledgement of a chapter in his life that had led, however painfully, to where he now stood. She had once been part of making him invisible. Now, fully seen and known by those who mattered most, he could view that past with perspective rather than pain. That evening, Nolan and Amelie sat on the porch of their lakeside home, the expanded and renovated cabin that had become their permanent residence. Maya and Thomas had joined them for dinner, but had departed earlier, eager to share their engagement news with Thomas's parents. I saw Victoria today, Nolan said as they watched the sunset paint the water in brilliant oranges and pinks. At the cemetery, Amelie nodded, unsurprised. Leonard mentioned she was in town. How was it? Unexpectedly ordinary, Nolan replied thoughtfully. Like meeting an old business associate rather than someone who wants to find my life. That's what healing looks like, Amelie observed. Not forgetting, but transforming the memory into something that no longer has power over you. Nolan reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over the wedding ring he had crafted for her 15 years earlier. She mentioned she's remarried. Seems to have found stability. Good for her, Amelie said without irony. Leonard brought the final paperwork for her donation to the scholarship fund today. It's quite substantial, enough to fund 4 full scholarships for the next decade. Life takes unexpected turns, Nolan mused. 15 years ago, I never would have imagined accepting anything from Victoria or her family. Now it seems like the right thing to do for the students, not for us. Amelie leaned her head against his shoulder. You once told me that you wanted justice, not revenge. Maybe this is the final piece of that justice. Everyone finding their proper place in the world, even if it's not what any of you anticipated. From inside the house, Nolan's phone chimed with an incoming email. He checked it briefly, then showed the screen to Amelie. It was a message from Leonard with the subject line, "Family chat access terminated." Part of their original settlement with the Caldwells had included Nolan's access to the family group chat as insurance. For years, he had maintained that access, but had checked it less and less frequently as his new life had taken shape. Now, 15 years later, the Caldwell family chat had been officially discontinued, the final vestige of that chapter of his life. Are you okay with this? Amelie asked, studying his expression in the fading light. Nolan nodded, a sense of completion washing over him. More than okay. It's overdue. He composed a brief reply to Leonard, acknowledged. No further action needed. Then he set the phone aside and turned his attention back to the sunset and the woman beside him. Maya asked if we'd host the wedding here, on the property, Amelie mentioned after a comfortable silence. Next summer, after her clerkship begins. Perfect, Nolan agreed, envisioning their daughter beginning her marriage in the place that had witnessed the renewal of his own life. I'll build them something special, maybe a wedding arch for the ceremony. And I suppose you'll be designing their dining table as well. Amelie teased, knowing his tradition of crafting furniture for significant family milestones. Of course, Nolan confirmed with a smile. Something that will last generations. As darkness settled over the lake, they remained on the porch, talking quietly about Maya's wedding plans and Thomas's integration into their family. Nolan felt a profound sense of contentment. Not the shallow happiness he had once mistaken for fulfillment during his marriage to Victoria, but something deeper and more authentic. 15 years ago, he had discovered his invisibility in the eyes of those who claimed to care for him. That painful revelation had set him on a path not just of justice, but of self-discovery. In becoming visible to himself, recognizing his worth, his capacities, his right to be fully seen, he had created a life where genuine connection replaced convenience, where respect replaced manipulation. The wooden box with hidden compartments that he had begun crafting the night he discovered the family chat still sat on his desk inside. Over the years, it had become a repository for meaningful mementos. Maya's first baby tooth, the first set of keys to the woodworking school, the receipt from his and Amelie's wedding dinner. What had begun as a physical manifestation of secrets uncovered had transformed into a treasure chest of a life well lived. What are you thinking about? Amelie asked, noticing his contemplative expression. Nolan smiled, drawing her closer. About visibility. About how sometimes you have to become invisible to those who never truly saw you in order to become visible to those who will. And have you, she asked, become fully visible? More and more each day, Nolan replied, his voice quiet but certain. With you, with Maya, with my students. Being seen isn't about demanding attention. It's about authentic presence with those who value it. As the first stars appeared over the lake, Nolan Pierce, once the invisible man, now fully present in a life of his own creation, embraced the peaceful certainty that justice had indeed been served, not through destruction, but through transformation. The painful discovery of 15 years ago had been not an ending, but a beginning. The first step toward a life more genuine, more connected, and more fulfilled than he could have imagined when he first picked up Victoria's old phone and glimpsed the truth behind the facade. In that moment of quiet reflection, Nolan realized that the greatest revenge against those who had once made him invisible was simply this: living visibly, purposefully, and authentically in a life rich with meaning and connection. No dramatic confrontation or punitive measure could have yielded a more complete justice than the full and generous life he now led, a life beyond the reach of those who had once sought to diminish him. The Invisible Man had not only become visible, he had become luminous. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.